The rain was a living thing that night, clawing at the windows of the old brick building on Marwood Lane, a street tucked away in the quieter part of Westbridge, where the city seemed to hold its breath. I stood in the hallway of apartment 3B, my boots leaving faint wet prints on the threadbare green carpet, my toolbox heavy in one hand, my jacket soaked through from the dash from my truck. I was 23, barely a month into free lungery, a plumber's apprentice still learning the difference between a pipe wrench and a crescent. The call had come in just after 6, a frantic voice on the line. Some friend of my boss, Terry, saying the tenant was panicking over a flooded kitchen. So here I was, in a part of town I'd never wandered into, staring at a heavy oak door with a brass knocker shaped like a sparrow, its eyes glinting under the flickering fluorescent light. I knocked twice, the sound swallowed by the storm's roar. Footsteps came, quick but soft, like someone moving with purpose but no rush. The door opened, and there she was, Lydia Ashwood, though I didn't know her name yet. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands escaping like they'd been tugged free in frustration. Her hazel eyes caught the dim light, sharp and deep, and for a moment I forgot the weight of my toolbox. She was older than me, late 30s or maybe just past 40, her face carrying a quiet strength, like someone who'd weathered storms of her own. Her gray sweater was soft, sleeves rolled up, and her jeans dusted with flour, as if she'd been kneading dough when the pipe betrayed her. There was a scar on her left knuckle, thin and white, a story she hadn't told. "You're the plumber?" Her voice was low, clear, with a faint edge of doubt, like she wasn't sure I could handle the job. I nodded too fast and lifted my toolbox as if it proved I belonged. "Come in, it's a disaster." She stepped aside, and I caught a whiff of lavender, mixed with something richer, like roasted coffee beans, as I brushed past her into the warmth of her apartment. The place was small, but felt like a home, not just a space. Bookshelves lined the living room, stuffed with worn paperbacks and a few framed photos I avoided staring at. The kitchen was to the right, a mess of water pooling under the sink, seeping into the cracked linoleum. A bucket sat nearby, overflowing, useless. Lydia hovered by the counter, arms crossed, watching me as I set my toolbox down and crouched to inspect the damage. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, maybe from whatever she'd been baking. "It started an hour ago," she said, leaning against the counter, her voice steady but tired. "I tried to fix it myself, but—" She gestured at the flood, her hands long and elegant, that scar catching my eye again. I wondered what had caused it, a knife slip, an old accident, but I didn't ask. Instead, I opened the cabinet under the sink, the wood swollen and creaking, and peered at the old copper pipe. The joint was leaking, water dripping steadily, like the building was bleeding out. "Looks like a busted seal," I said, trying to sound like I'd seen 100 of these, though my hands were still learning the feel of the tools. "Should be quick." I grabbed a wrench, the metal cool against my palm, and glanced up at her. She wasn't watching the pipe. She was watching me, her gaze steady, not impatient, but like she was measuring something in me I couldn't name. It made my pulse jump, though I told myself it was just the pressure of the job. "You live here alone?" I asked, the words slipping out to fill the silence as I tightened the fitting. It was a dumb question, too personal, but the rain outside was loud, and the quiet in here felt heavier. She didn't answer right away. She turned to the stove, where a kettle was starting to hum, the sound soft against the storm. "For now," she said finally, her voice quieter, like she was answering something deeper. "My daughter's at college, just me and the occasional chaos." She nodded toward the sink, a faint smile curling her lips, like she was letting me in on a secret she didn't share often. I nodded, focusing on the pipe to keep my thoughts from wandering. The wrench slipped once, and I muttered a curse under my breath, hoping she didn't hear. She did. "You're new at this, aren't you?" she said, not cruelly, but with a warmth that caught me off guard. I laughed, cheeks heating. "That obvious?" "You've got that look," she said, pouring hot water into a mug, steam curling up like a ghost in the dim light of the pendant lamp. "Like you're still deciding if you're good enough." I tightened the fitting, the leak slowing to a trickle. "Getting there," I said, glancing at her. "Just takes a few floods to learn." She laughed, a low, throaty sound that hit me like a shock, tightening my chest for reasons I couldn't pin down. I kept working, checking the fittings twice, wiping down the cabinet, anything to stretch the moment. She didn't seem to mind. She sipped her tea, asking about my work, my hometown, small talk, but it felt like more, like every word was a step into something I wasn't supposed to want. The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time I packed up. Lydia stood by the door, arms crossed, her sweater slipping off one shoulder, revealing a collarbone that looked too delicate for the weight she seemed to carry. "Thanks for coming out so late," she said. "I didn't expect anyone to brave this weather." "No problem," I said, hefting my toolbox. "Marwood Lane's not exactly the wilderness." She laughed again, and that tightness in my chest returned, sharper this time, like I'd missed a step on a staircase I didn't see. "Still," she said, "you didn't have to be so thorough." "Just doing my job," I said, shrugging, but my voice felt unsteady, like I was trying to convince myself. Her eyes held mine a beat too long, and there was something in them, not just gratitude, but something heavier, like she saw me, not just the kid with the wrench. "You're good at it," she said, and her voice carried a weight that made my throat tight. I mumbled a goodbye and stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me, the air cold and sharp against my damp skin. As I walked to my truck, the rain soaking through my jacket, I couldn't shake her, the way her fingers brushed the mug, the scar on her knuckle, the way her smile felt like a secret. I glanced back at the building, her window glowing faintly through the drizzle. Something in me knew I'd be back, though I had no reason to believe it yet. You don't know what's coming. She's about to make a choice that will turn everything upside down. 3 days later, I found myself back on Marwood Lane, though I hadn't meant to return so soon. My boss, Terry, had gotten another call from his friend about Lydia's apartment, this time a flickering light in her living room, some ancient wiring issue in the ceiling fixture. Terry was buried in jobs across town, so he tossed me the work order, muttering about keeping the client happy. I didn't argue. Truth was, I'd been replaying that night in her kitchen all week, the way Lydia's laugh had curled into my chest, the way her hazel eyes seemed to see more than I was ready to show. I told myself it was just a job, just a chance to prove I wasn't a complete rookie, but the way my hands tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled onto her street said otherwise. It was late afternoon, the sky bruised with gray clouds that hung low, threatening rain but not committing. Marwood Lane was quiet, the kind of street where old maples leaned over the sidewalk, their leaves whispering in the breeze. I parked my truck outside her building, a 3-story brick relic with ivy clawing up its sides, and grabbed my toolbox and a folding stepladder from the back. The air smelled of wet asphalt and distant wood smoke, like someone nearby was burning a fire to ward off the chill. As I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, my boots echoed in the empty hallway, and I noticed things I'd missed last time. A cracked tile near the stairwell, a faded poster for a jazz festival pinned to a corkboard, its edges curling like it had been there for years. I knocked on Lydia's door, the brass sparrow knocker cool under my knuckles. The door opened faster than before, like she'd been waiting, though her expression didn't give it away. Her hair was down today, dark waves spilling over her shoulders, catching the soft light of the hallway. She wore a dark green blouse, its fabric clinging lightly to her frame, and jeans that looked worn in a way that felt deliberate, like they'd seen her through good days and bad. She was older than me, closer to 40 now that I saw her in the daylight, but there was a grace to her movements, a quiet confidence that made her seem younger, like she was carrying something heavy, but refusing to let it define her. "Noah," she said, her voice warm but with a teasing lilt, like she was testing me. "Back to rescue me again?" I grinned, shifting the toolbox to my other hand, the stepladder tucked under my arm. "Your apartment's got it out for you," I said. "First the sink, now the lights?" She stepped aside, letting me in. "Old buildings," she said, her tone light but with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. "They keep you busy." As I passed her, I caught that same lavender scent mixed with something earthier, like the coffee she'd been brewing last time. The apartment felt warmer today, the living room bathed in the soft glow of a floor lamp. The ceiling fixture, a brass chandelier that looked like it belonged in a museum, flickered every few seconds, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Bookshelves lined one side of the room, stuffed with novels and art journals, and a worn leather couch sat against the window, a knitted throw draped over its arm. I set my toolbox down and unfolded the stepladder, trying to focus on the job. "Need me to hold anything?" Lydia asked, leaning against the couch, her arms crossed casually, though her eyes were on me, not the chandelier. "Nah, I'm good," I said, climbing the ladder to get a look at the wiring. It was a mess, frayed, tangled, probably as old as the building itself. I started unscrewing the fixture's cover, my hands steady, but my mind anything but. She was close, closer than she needed to be, and I could feel her watching me, her presence like a low hum in the air. I caught her reflection in a framed painting on the wall, a foggy valley, all muted greens and grays, and it made my fingers fumble, the screwdriver slipping once. "You're quiet when you work," she said after a few minutes, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, sharp but not unkind. I glanced down, one hand still on the fixture. "Trying not to fry myself," I said, half joking, though the truth was her gaze was making it hard to concentrate. She laughed, that low, throaty sound that hit me harder than it should have, and I turned back to the wires, stripping one carefully to keep my hands busy. "Want coffee?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. I was about to make some. "Sure," I said, mostly because it felt rude to refuse, though I didn't need the caffeine. My nerves were already buzzing. I heard the clink of mugs, the soft rush of water, and I tried to focus on the wires, but my mind kept drifting to her. The way her blouse hugged her shoulders, the scar on her knuckle, the way she moved like she was always holding something back. I didn't know why these things stuck with me, but they did, like fragments of a song I couldn't place. She came back with 2 mugs, setting one on the coffee table for me. The steam curled up, carrying the scent of something dark and rich, not the cheap stuff I drank at gas stations. "You're not from around here, are you?" she said, settling onto the couch, one leg tucked under her, her fingers wrapped around her mug. I stepped down from the ladder, wiping my hands on a rag. "Easton," About an hour north, I said, picking up the mug, the warmth seeping into my palms. Moved here for work. You? Born and raised in Westbridge, she said, her eyes drifting to the window where the clouds were darkening. Lived in this apartment for 10 years. Used to be me, my daughter, and... She trailed off, her fingers tightening on her mug. Just me now. The pause was heavy, like she was deciding whether to let me past a gate she kept locked. I didn't push, just took a sip of the coffee, strong and bitter, and let the silence settle. The light flickered again, and I climbed back up, working faster now, though my hands weren't as steady as I wanted. We talked as I worked, about the diner on Backman Street, the traffic on Marwood Lane, the way the city felt alive in the rain. But then she said, "So Noah, why plumbing? You don't strike me as the type to settle for fixing leaks." I paused, wire stripper in hand, the question catching me off guard. "What's that mean?" I asked, glancing down at her. She shrugged, her smile soft but piercing. "You've got this spark, like you're meant for something bigger. This feels like a pit stop for you." I laughed, shaking my head, though her words hit closer than I wanted to admit. "You sound like my mom," I said. "I'm good with my hands, and it pays. Not everyone needs a grand plan, right?" Her eyes met mine, steady, unyielding. "Maybe," she said, "but you're young. You've got time to figure it out." There was something in her voice, not judgment, but a quiet challenge, like she saw something in me I hadn't named yet. "And you?" I asked, turning the question back on her. "What's your plan?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was softer, almost fragile. "I had one once, now I just keep moving." There was a crack in her words, a glimpse of something raw, and I wanted to ask more, to know what had broken her plan, but I didn't. Instead, I finished the wiring, the chandelier glowing steady now, no more flickering. I folded the ladder, took another sip of coffee, and tried to ignore the way her presence pulled at me like gravity I couldn't see. Thanks for the coffee," I said, holding up the mug. "Beats the sludge I usually drink." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Anytime, Noah." She stood brushing her hands on her jeans, and we were suddenly closer, the space between us shrinking. I noticed the way her hair fell over one shoulder, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the coffee table, like she was anchoring herself. I wanted to say something, to name the thing crackling in the air, but my throat felt tight, and all I could do was nod. "I should go," I said, grabbing my toolbox and ladder. "Call if anything else breaks." She walked me to the door, her steps slow, deliberate. "I will," she said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "You're good company, Noah." Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I stopped, hand on the doorknob. "You're not bad yourself," I said, trying to keep it light, but my voice betrayed me, coming out softer, heavier. Her eyes held mine, and for a moment I thought she might say something more, something that would shift the ground under us. But she just smiled, a private, guarded smile, and opened the door. As I stepped into the hallway, her gaze followed me, heavy and warm, like a touch I could still feel. I didn't look back, but I carried it with me down the stairs, into the truck, where the cold leather seat grounded me. I sat there, staring at her building, the steady light in her window cutting through the gathering dusk. Something was shifting, and I didn't know what it was, but it felt like standing on the edge of something vast and uncharted. What she does next will break every rule they've both been following, and he won't see it coming. A week later, I was back on Marwood Lane, though I had no business being there. I'd been driving home from a late job in the warehouse district, my truck rattling through the fog-choked streets of Westbridge, when I saw the sign for her street. I don't know why I turned. Maybe it was the way the fog swallowed the streetlights, turning them into soft halos. Or maybe it was her. The way Lydia's laugh had lodged itself in my chest. The way her hazel eyes seemed to see past my clumsy attempts at confidence. I was 23, still figuring out who I was, but something about her made me feel like I was already someone. I told myself it was nothing, just a restless night, but my hands were gripping the wheel too tight, and my heart was pounding as I pulled into the parking lot outside her building. I sat there for a minute, the engine idling, the fog curling against the windshield like smoke. In the passenger seat was a paper bag from the Almond Cafe, a little diner on Backman Street we'd talked about last time. I'd grabbed an extra sandwich, roast beef, and arugula, telling myself it was for me, but I knew better. It was an excuse, a flimsy reason to show up at her door unannounced. I grabbed the bag, my toolbox left behind in the truck, and climbed the stairs to the third floor, my boots heavy on the worn carpet. The hallway was quiet, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly, and that cracked tile near the stairwell caught my eye again, like a reminder of how out of place I felt. I knocked on Lydia's door, the brass sparrow knocker cold under my knuckles, and for a moment I hoped she wasn't home. It would have been easier to walk away, to pretend this was just a fleeting urge. But then I heard her footsteps, soft and deliberate, and the door opened. She stood there, her dark hair loose, spilling over her shoulders in waves that caught the dim light. She wore a navy sweater, the kind that looked soft enough to sink into, and jeans that hugged her in a way that made my throat tighten. Her feet were bare, toes curling slightly against the hardwood, and I realized she was older than me. 42, maybe, though her face held a quiet beauty that made the years feel irrelevant. Her hazel eyes widened slightly, taking me in, and I felt exposed, like I'd shown up with my intentions written across my face. Noah. Her voice was a mix of surprise and something softer, like she wasn't sure whether to be wary or glad. No leaks or lights this time. What's going on? I held up the paper bag, the crinkle of it loud in the quiet hallway. I was passing by, I said, the words sounding thinner than I'd hoped. Got an extra sandwich from the Almond. Thought you might like it. You said you liked their stuff. It was a weak excuse, and I knew it, but her lips twitched into a small, careful smile that made my chest ache. That's thoughtful, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Come in. I was just about to eat something anyway. Her voice was warm, but there was a guarded edge to it, like she was weighing every word. The apartment felt different at night, the air thicker, the lights softer, casting long shadows across the living room. A faint scent of cinnamon hung in the air, maybe from a candle that had burned out earlier. The bookshelves were the same, stuffed with novels and art journals, but I noticed a small stack of letters on the coffee table, tied with a piece of twine, like they'd been read and reread. Lydia led me to the kitchen, where a half-empty glass of red wine sat on the counter next to a cutting board with a loaf of crusty bread, its crumbs scattered like tiny constellations. She took the bag from me, her fingers brushing mine for a split second, and I felt a jolt, sharp and unnameable. Roast beef and arugula, she said, peering into the bag. Good call? She glanced at me, her smile widening just enough to show a hint of warmth. You're lucky I'm hungry. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but my hands were restless, shoving into my pockets, then out again. Didn't want it to go to waste, I said, leaning against the counter as she pulled out 2 plates. We sat at her small dining table, the sandwich split between us. and for a while it was easy. Talking about the cafe, the way the fog made the city feel like a dream, the time I'd gotten lost on a delivery job and ended up at a dead-end street by the river. She laughed at my stories, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, and I noticed how her shoulders softened, how her voice grew quieter when she wasn't guarding something. But then the conversation slowed, and the air thickened, like the fog had slipped inside, settling between us. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes on me, steady and piercing, like she could see every thought I wasn't saying. "You didn't just come here for a sandwich, did you?" she said, her voice low, not accusing, but cutting straight to the truth. I froze, my half-eaten sandwich forgotten on the plate. My throat felt tight, and her gaze was pulling something out of me, something I wasn't ready to name. "I don't know," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. "I just wanted to see you." The words felt raw, like I'd peeled back a layer of myself I hadn't meant to show. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes softened, just for a moment, before a shadow crossed them. She set her glass down, her fingers lingering on the stem, and I noticed that scar on her knuckle again, a thin white line that seemed to carry a story I'd never know. "Noah," she said, my name heavy in her mouth, like it cost her something to say it. "I'm older than you." "A lot older." I swallowed, my hands clenching under the table. "I know," I said, meeting her gaze. "I'm not blind. I don't care." She laughed, a short, sharp sound that wasn't cruel, but wasn't warm either. "You should," she said, leaning forward, her elbows on the table, her eyes locked on mine. "You're 23, Noah. I'm 42. I have a daughter who's almost your age. This—" She gestured between us, her hand slicing through the air. "It's not simple. It's not right." I looked at her, really looked at her. The lines around her eyes, the way her hair fell in soft waves, the quiet strength in her posture, like she'd built herself back up from something broken. She was beautiful, not in the way people my age chased, but in a way that felt deeper, earned through years I couldn't touch. "I said you're older than me," I said, my voice steadier now, though my heart was hammering. "And you laughed, said that makes it even more interesting." Her eyes widened, just a fraction, and then she laughed again, softer, like I'd caught her off guard. "You're trouble," she said, shaking her head, but there was a warmth in her voice, a crack in her armor that made my chest tighten. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I'm not trying to get into anything," I said, leaning forward, the table creaking under my weight. I keep thinking about you. I don't know why, but I can't stop." The words spilled out raw and honest, and I felt exposed, like I'd handed her something fragile and waited to see if she'd crush it. Her breath caught, and I saw her hands tremble slightly on the table. She stood abruptly, turning toward the counter, her back to me, her shoulders tense. "You shouldn't say things like that," she said, her voice tight, like she was holding back a flood. "You don't know me, Noah. You don't know what I've lost, what I'm carrying." "Then tell me," I said, standing too, my chair scraping against the floor. I stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough to feel the heat of her presence, the air charged between us. "I want to know, not to fix it, but because I see you, and I can't look away." She turned, her eyes searching mine, and for the first time I saw something raw in her. Fear, longing, a pain she'd buried deep. "You don't know what I feel," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but she didn't step back. We stood there, inches apart, the silence louder than any words. Her hand brushed mine, just for a second, a spark that burned through me. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her closer, but I didn't. Not yet. She stepped back, breaking the moment, and ran a hand through her hair, her fingers trembling. "It's late," she said, her voice steadier now, but still soft, like she was trying to convince herself. "You should go." I nodded, though every part of me wanted to stay, to bridge the gap she'd put between us. I grabbed my jacket, the paper bag still crumpled on the table, a reminder of my flimsy excuse. At the door I turned, looking at her one last time. She stood by the counter, arms crossed, her eyes on the floor, but then she looked up, meeting my gaze. "Lydia," I said, my voice low, steady. I meant every word. She didn't answer, but her eyes held mine, and that was enough. I stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me, the sound sharp in the quiet. The fog outside was thicker now, swallowing the streetlights, but I felt lighter, like I'd left something behind and carried something new with me. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I couldn't walk away from her, not completely. Not now. What happens now will change them both forever, and it's closer than he thinks.